Exodus chapter 7, verse 8 says, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it'll become a snake." Verse 10, "So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same thing by their secret arts." There's a lot going on here. The study of Egypt and everything that they were into, this highly developed, highly technological, dark art connected nation. And so there were things that would go on that would have been really hard to explain. Each one of them threw down his staff and it became a snake, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. So this is week 2 of daddy issues. And last week we talked about Joseph and this transition from a limited father that loved him very much, but could only go so far. And Joseph being adopted into a personal relationship with God who is unlimited. And that the unlimited, all-knowing God brings Joseph through this process that Jacob could have never brought him through, so much further. And it results in Joseph moving the family to Egypt. It was the drought that had come, that had wiped out all the land around them. They bring him to Egypt. They live as part of the family of the Egyptians. 430 years later, after Joseph brought the Israelites to Egypt, 430 years later, God is about to bring the Israelites back out of Egypt. So this is kind of the bookend story about how it started and how it ended, how they went from where they were to Egypt, and then from Egypt to where they're going to go next. Exodus chapter 2, verse 5, it says, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank." There had been an edict that all the children, all the Hebrew children, were going to be put to death. And so one of the moms of the Hebrews had a baby, and she does what good moms do. She disobeyed. She was non-compliant. She didn't stay 6 feet apart, and she didn't wear a mask. And she knows it's not the best chance for her baby, but she knows that keeping it isn't a very good chance either. So she puts him in a basket, and she puts him in the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh, again, hard to even express the power that the fatherly figure, the Pharaoh, would have held in this story. His daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby, and he was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Then his sister, so who's his? Moses. Moses' sister sees the opportunity and says, "Do you want me to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse him for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." It's an interesting story. Again, probably one we've already heard. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. That's a fascinating part of that story I don't want to miss over. He became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So already, as a baby, Moses goes beyond his limited father's ability. We talked about this with Joseph too, that Jacob didn't know that Joseph was in a well and he was unable to rescue him. Probably the first time he felt failed by his father. In this story, it just happened so much earlier that the power of Moses' family was not enough to keep Pharaoh at bay, and so they put him out into God's protection. Right on the heels of that, Moses gets adopted by a different culture. The Bible says he became her son. I know that I'm talking about a spectrum here, and I know that when we're talking about daddy issues, I know it's a spectrum. And I think that there would be this knee-jerk if you're a single mom and you're working really hard to keep your family together, to hear a sermon about how valuable the role of a father is. And I don't want to overlook that. I fully get it. What I'm saying is, in a perfect scenario, this is what the call of men is. But throughout the entire Bible, when men fail, God raises women up to step in also. But just specifically, I don't want to spread the sermon so thin that we don't get any value out of it. I specifically want to look at the daddy issues that develop because of the situations Moses was in. put in the Nile River by his own people, adopted as part of the family, as part of Pharaoh's family by the Egyptians. Again, back to a spectrum thing. Here's one of the things that we know about fathers is that it is the role of the father to determine the culture of the home. Now, if this was not your experience, it doesn't mean that what I'm saying is wrong. It means that it has been altered. In a perfect scenario, a dad determines the culture of a home. When you say a culture, what I mean is what is important and what isn't important. You know, they say that a lot of times women are really, really passionate in a home or about something with the kids. But if the dad is against her, it's a very uphill battle. Very hard to accomplish something in the culture of your children when the father is against it. But if the father is really, really passionate about what is and what isn't important, then usually that's how it goes. And the mom finds ways to make it a home in that scenario, in that situation. For instance, there are some families who their culture is very oriented around health and fitness. You know, the dad, he's like a workout buff, and he wants his kids to be a workout buff because whatever motivated him to get in shape, he feels motivated for his kids. And so the dad's like, no, part of our culture, we are a fitness family. Education. You see dads all the time who education means something so meaningful to them, and so they aren't real high on the social element. They're real high on the education element. You can have a social life once your education is done because they see it as a value part of their culture. I know this is basic stuff. It's all nuts and bolts. It's important to get to the platform where we're going to. Religion. They say that 94% of children raised in a home where the father was the spiritual leader stay engaged at a church level. So when the dad makes it a priority, dad makes the cultural priority, it sticks with the children. When the dad is not involved in that, only 17% of kids find themselves still attending a church model of some sort into adulthood. So it's a big indicator of the role of culture that a dad plays. Things like the way we view money, the way we view power. You know, you see kids that are raised by really money-driven men that become money-driven children. The only way they could rebel against their fathers would be to rebel against the things that he thought were important. So much of these things, like relational cultural issues, not just the traditional culture of what's important, what's not, but also how we interact with each other, how much mercy, how much grace we give each other, how much kindness, how much honor, the way that we treat women. I think so many times you see young boys not really understanding how to treat the women in their homes because it hasn't been demonstrated for them in a way that makes sense. The husband is a disrespectful person, and the son instantly picks up on it and begins to replicate or copy the culture that he's seen in front of him. So Moses is adopted into the home of Pharaoh. It says he became her son. She named him. He wasn't just adjacent to Pharaoh. Moses was raised under the culture of Pharaoh. One of the things that we see about the culture of Pharaoh, things that we know about Pharaoh because of what we see being demonstrated throughout Egypt, is that slavery was a big portion of the Egyptian culture. Pharaoh was the one who had determined that slavery was a big part of the culture of Egypt. That tells you a little bit about how he felt about people. People were easy to replace. They were not valuable. They were not something that were thought of in really high regard. It says that Pharaoh thought of people as useful, only as useful. He was willing to mistreat people. He had a scepter that represented power and destruction, and all of the things that were necessary to protect the greatness of Egypt was held in his right hand in his scepter. Anger followed him a lot. Powerful leader who led through force. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because as a young boy, Moses is growing up with the father figure that held all of these things in very high regard. I know this is going to seem like a really odd segue, but I think about Talladega Nights. You've got Ricky Bobby, and there's this culture that he holds for himself of like, you know, I'm just the best there is, and I can't be beat, and he's very boisterous and all this. And then you meet his kids, and his kids are just little replicas, just out of control, wild, foul-mouthed little replicas of Ricky Bobby because the dad had set a culture in the home, and the kids were living in the culture. I know it's an odd reference. Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 says, one day after Moses had grown up where? Under Pharaoh, under the culture of enforcement and power and punitive and all the things that Pharaoh said were important in the culture. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So in a moment of rage, he sees what's happening and operates fully under the culture of how he had been raised. It's strange to think that in a moment, Moses demonstrates the culture that he had been raised in. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. It's a weird thing to understand the rage that would lead you to murder. I'm fortunate that I've never had to be anywhere really near that. Nobody that I really know very well has ever murdered anyone or been murdered. I mean, I understand it at a head level, but I don't understand it at a passionate level. But it says that that's how Moses had been raised. And in a moment, his culture comes to the surface. And when Pharaoh heard this, what happened? He tried to kill Moses. All that's happening here is you're following the chain links from the culture that was created by Pharaoh throughout the people, and then they start to operate in it, and now it almost gets him killed, because when you live by the sword, you die by the sword, right? This culture that you surround yourself with, you will suffer the effects and the consequences of it. It is important to know what your culture is, because that culture will dictate a lot about the situations in your life. It's fascinating how often people are repeating the culture of their fathers without even realizing it. I don't think that Moses thought to himself, I'll do what my dad taught me. I think he just reacted, but his reaction had been preconditioned by his culture. I think sometimes we get mad at our dad without realizing that his mistakes are usually a result of his culture to us. And the way that we live based on the culture that we've lived under gets passed down to us, to our children. The culture is a giant problem if we don't take it serious. Think about it, going back to Talladega Nights for a minute. What's funny is he is this, if you're not first, you're last. If you're not first, you're last. This is our culture. If you're not first, you're last. His kids are like, yeah, if you're not first, you're last. We're going to jump on you like a spider monkey and kill the Egyptians. And then he meets the dad, and the dad's kind of a derelict, sort of just not real involved dad. And he goes, remember, Dad, you said if you're not first, you're last. And the dad's like, I was drunk when I said that. Of course you can win second or third or fourth. And an accidental moment from a father to a son set the course of a culture. So really, in a large way, Pharaoh, Moses' limited father, had failed Moses. He created a culture and then punished Moses for living up to it. It says, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs for their father's flocks. I didn't know this. I learned this week. I think this is so fascinating. A lot of times when it talks about somebody being a shepherd in the Bible, we think, King David was a shepherd. Moses would become a shepherd. We think of shepherds and these men and the shepherding roles. And I think one of the biggest criticisms of my leadership style is I'm just not a very, shepherdy type personality. What I found out, 7 daughters, and they came to draw water in the troughs, is that the actual shepherding, the voice, the leadership to the sheep, the shepherds that the sheep would follow were often women. And the men would oversee the flocks. There was a very intimate, personal, day-to-day relationship between the shepherd, that were women, and the flocks, and they would follow their voices. The sheep would follow their voices. A lot of the times, you go back and you look at the verses that talk about shepherds in the Bible, you can imagine almost more clearly as what women are. Like the way that my wife shepherds our family. She shepherds the day-to-day stuff. She's overseeing the care. She's the, intimately relational type person with everybody in our family. I understand the concept of shepherding better by understanding her. Not the sermon, but interesting. Remember when Joseph, last week we said that Joseph got sold into slavery and went into Potiphar's house. He found himself under a new father figure, but also under a new culture. That he hadn't just left his home, he had left his culture, and he found himself now in a new culture. New dad, new culture. This is exactly what happens to Moses. The commentators, this is, again, I know I mentioned it last week, but so much of what I'm learning is coming through the Bema podcast right now with Marty Solomon. The guy, he just points to some cool stuff. But one of the things that I know personally is you can't intimidate and force animals in a way that you can people. You can intimidate from a position of power, and people tend to go along with it. Animals don't go along with it quite so well. Your leadership style from Pharaoh, which is attack and beat and punish, doesn't work with a shepherd. It says that a shepherd, there's verses in the Bible that say, my sheep know my what? My voice. The culture of Pharaoh was rage and punishment and fighting and enforcement. I'm going to kill you. No, I'm going to kill you first. It's a mob mentality. It's a mafia mentality in Egypt. And Moses finds himself now in a shepherding culture and is completely 100% different. Leaders in the shepherding world use their voices and their influence. They don't have a scepter to create enforcement. They have a staff to lead and to help sort. It's just a completely different culture. And this is where God chooses to take Moses. Because remember, Moses is going to be tasked with drawing the children of Israel out of Egypt. And he grew up in a culture of demands and enforcement. Actually, had Moses not transitioned in his culture, he would have just been another Pharaoh in a new location. Everything is voice and influence. It's the staff versus the scepter approach to leadership. Moses came to the desert with some severe daddy issues, believing that to be an effective leader, it required that you be in charge and that you be powerful and that you be feared and respected and revered and all these things that capitalist societies tend to celebrate also. To lead required power. And it's interesting that God sends him to the place where that kind of power is useless. He sends him to a place of influence where his previous culture didn't make sense and wouldn't work. Moses wouldn't be empowered to lead until he had fully transitioned out of the old culture. In my home, I think of this. I think of if I was going to be the most effective pastor or leader or husband or father, there's two different cultures in the way that we lead. Even the way that we lead other Christians, the way that we love other Christians. I mean, how often do you hear of Christians going through a hard time and the other Christians are the hardest on them? Some of the most open and loving and accepting environments you can find yourself in are with people that aren't believers because they don't hold themselves to the same standards. There's a broken concept to culture that has even crept into the church. God didn't relocate Moses to a new land. He relocated him to a new culture. You could say he moved him from Egypt to Midian, but it was so much more than that. He moved him from enforcement and power and rules to influence and voice. From empire to shepherding. Exodus 3, verse 8 says, so I've come down to rescue them. This is God talking to Moses. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Skip to verse 9. It says, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, see, I connect to this in a lot of ways because when we left Texas, I was very familiar with how Texas does things, how Texas, runs churches and religions and social interactions. And I understood how the rodeo world there worked and our people, I was familiar with it. I understood it. And I get to Oregon and so much of it's different. The people up here are more community minded, less individualistic. There's just little ways that the culture is different here. And you don't pick it up in an instant. It takes a while before you start understanding kind of how it works. So what God is telling Moses is, I'm sending you back to Texas, to something you're familiar with. You've learned how things are done here, and I'm going to send you back into an old life. I'm going to send you back into an old structure. Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? What he's saying is, I don't have enough power. I don't have enough followers. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough social media following. I don't have a scepter. He has a scepter, and my scepter isn't very big. He's got power and enforcement from the old culture, and I don't have any. Instantly, when Moses starts thinking, if the world's going to actually change, if I'm going to actually be a part of seeing change in my family, in my generation, in the things that God's called me to, we instantly go back to our original culture. We instantly think of it in terms of the culture that we were raised in. God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. God says it's the culture that you've been submerged in Midian that's going to be the most useful. I'm not calling you back to your old culture. I'm calling you to remain in the new culture, even going back to an old setting. See, I think it's hard even for people like that give their life to God and they're really trying to work on this relationship thing, and they find themselves around old friends to not slip back into old patterns. You know, like Moses, what brought about the murder of the Egyptian slave was there was a moment of just white hot catalyst that pushed him so far into anger and rage and punishment and murder. And I think that's a little bit of what I'm talking about is like, hey, God's going to send Moses back into an old setting with loyalty to his new culture. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they asked, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? They had actually started to assimilate into the Egyptian culture pretty well. It doesn't say that there was this big, giant, loving God culture amongst the Israelites. It says that they lived in Goshen and they were farmers and they were out in this fertile land area and they lived kind of like traveling gypsies out there, and they would move, and it was a traveling lifestyle. But it doesn't say that they lived in cages. So there was a little bit about what the Egyptians had going on that the Israelites had kind of gotten okay with. So when Moses says, I'm going to go back and I'm going to tell them this, who do I tell them that I am? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is who you are to say to the Israelites. This is what you're saying to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Pharaoh was thought of as an intermediary between man and the gods of Egypt. He was this person, and when Pharaoh spoke, he was speaking on behalf of the gods. He was this larger-than-life, more powerful than imagined figure in Egypt, and this is who they're going to have to go convince or go confront. And Moses goes, who do I tell them that you are? And he says, tell them that I'm not who they think I am, and I'm not Pharaoh. I'm not sending someone to come in and better educate you on your current system. I am sending my person, my shepherd, who's operating under a completely new culture of love and mercy and compassion and influence and voice, not someone who's rage and war and chaos. I'm sending them somebody who understands my nature because of the years I've spent in the desert shepherding, and I'm sending them somebody with my nature, and I will speak to you through him. In a sense, he was sending Moses as a mirror reflection of who they believed Pharaoh to be. I want to speak to the fathers just for a second. And I'm going to tell you right now, I have failed at what I'm about to say so many times. I say it in a true heart of confession that there are times that what I'm about to talk about, I've done very poorly. I think that we celebrate the wrong culture because we live in an empire. I think if we're not careful, we celebrate things that look more like the Egyptian culture than the shepherding culture. In the way that we lead, in the way that we parent, in the way that we are husband to our wives, in the way that we drive, in the amount of money that we want to make. I listened to everything that the Egyptians held valuable of what was important and what wasn't, what their culture was. And it actually seems in almost alarming fashion like a capitalistic society of just kill or be killed and go and go and go and fight for what you have to have tooth and nail. And I think if we're not careful, that kind of culture creeps into our lives and we become a source of damage or pain in the circles that God calls us. We celebrate things like power and enforcement and compliance. And we veered so far away from the sphere of influence that God created for us in this shepherding voice influence model of leadership. You know, you look at who Moses was when he came out of the desert, he was a completely different person. He was humble. He was afraid that if he went back, he wouldn't have enough power. And I think we've veered so far away from that into power-driven, empire-driven, who has the biggest toys and the deepest bank accounts, that because we don't, it leaves us feeling powerless and unable to lead, like that our leadership isn't valuable, that our influence in our families isn't valuable because we don't have what someone else has. I think if we're not careful, we have started trying to lead with a scepter instead of a shepherd's staff. You look at the structure of even churches. If we're not careful, we get so in goal driven that pretty soon the church is hard to distinguish from a business in the rest of the world. Maybe, and I don't think this is just for men, I think this is for anybody, maybe we've been damaged by a faulty culture. Maybe we grew up in one. My wife laughs at me all the time because there are things that we learned growing up in Johnson County that we just didn't question. It's just how it was. It's just how people did it. And you get out, and the more you get out, and the more you travel, the more you start to realize, like, oh, that's not how everybody does it. That's just how Johnson County does it. I think that's true of homes, too. I think there's true where you think that what your parents did was normal, or what your family did, or what your school did was normal. Our school was openly racist. But it was our only school. We really didn't have anything to compare it to, and we didn't have social media to condemn it in the way that we do now. And there were things that just were. Kids that are raised in homes of addiction or abuse or neglect, it would be very easy to get a flawed concept about the culture of our Father. Maybe your parents left you with a really flawed understanding of what a culture of leadership or a family looks like. I think about Moses almost as a victim. I know that sounds weird, but it's like Moses was almost the victim of his culture. He was just doing what he'd seen his dad do, and it caused damage in his own life. That's the hard part. When we're raised in a culture that causes damage, and then we find ourselves causing damage. So let's read verse 10 again and see if it doesn't start to make more sense. Moses is going to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. He's not going to drive them out. He's not going to take on a war with Pharaoh. He's not going to go in with nukes. He goes in and he uses his voice. He leans on God and depends on God for his influence. It says, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff. What is the staff? It's a shepherd's staff. Throws his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned some of his wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same thing by their secret arts. Each one of them threw down his staff. See, a staff in Egypt and a staff in Midian were two different things. It was a scepter of enforcement and rules and power and all of the culture that Egypt had to offer. And keep in mind, God's getting ready to bring the children of Israel from slavery, which is the result of power aimed in the wrong direction. And he's about to bring them into freedom. Right now, they follow the rules, but they're about to be in the desert where they follow a voice. And this is a converging point between the two. Each one of them threw down his staff, and it became a snake, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Pharaoh misses it. I mean, Pharaoh looks right at it, sees it, looks right at it and sees it, and yet his heart becomes hardened and he rejects it. And I would say that's still obviously an option, but when we're called to lead in our cultures, when we're called to create cultures, and I think sometimes some of our most effective leadership doesn't come from positions of power. It comes from positions of influence. It's like not the guy who's the CEO of the company, but it's like the gal that does all the administrative work, and she knows really what's best for the company. And so she, in really kind, loving ways, comes in and kind of guides him to more success. I mean, there are so many ways that God puts us in positions of influence that don't require ultimate power. But when we're in positions of influence in our families, in our work environments, in our homes, in our personal lives, the power to lead does not come through the ability to defeat. If we're going to make a significant impact in the world where God's placed us, it's not because we're so powerful that we can defeat the things that come up against us. It's through hearing the voice of God, it's through leaning into the influence and creating a culture that better reflects the nature of God. The staff's being thrown down, that's a significant moment that says, okay, that feels like a weaker position. There's a strong position and there's a weaker position. The weaker position is a submitted to God position. We're operating on influence and voice. It's a shepherding approach. It's not empire. This one says power and empire, the ability to defeat your enemies. And God says, but when they're both put together, the real power lies in the staff of a shepherd. Peace, mercy, forgiveness. I know that we're going through some changes at Shiloh, and in the last year for sure, maybe year and a half, I've so badly wanted to do some things that would ramp up the energy. I think I'm fairly good at that. But I felt so confident that there was a culture development that we were going through. We were going through a culture development that was exposed by COVID. That when we backed up, we went, wait a minute, there's some things that we need to look at. There's some things that we need to do better. There's some areas, some gaps that we need to fill in. And it's not by being the most dominant church in the area where we can brag about having the most people and, hey, do it right or you're out and we're going to just demand, and it just doesn't fit. But I don't want to be so church-centric that we miss the idea that God is bringing you, your life, out of whatever culture you were raised in into the culture that you're going to raise your children in. Sometimes you look at the very best culture that you were raised out of and go, if I could recreate that, that would be awesome. Other times you go, that's not how it's demonstrated for me. Maybe I was raised more in an Egyptian culture, but I want to take the opportunity to make that right. I'm willing to go through the desert periods, the desert times. I'm willing to go through the difficulties of learning how to become a shepherd and trusting the voice, trusting the story, using a staff to encourage instead of a scepter to demand. I think if we get there individually, we get there as a group of people where we can start leaning in and encouraging, really wanting the best for each other, really trusting that God's telling a story here. I think when we get there at an individual level, we all become more healthy as a body of people. We set down our daddy issues that we've carried in from spiritual situations or past experiences or all of the things that we take and replicate and mimic, and we go, whoa, stop. This is where God's leading me. This is what it requires. This is what it looks like. And that's what I'm going to pursue. And that's where the power lies. That's the staff that eats the other staff. That's where the staff eats the scepter. And we see breakthroughs in our lives. And our children benefit from that. Our children remember a family that was raised believing in who God was and watching God being able to miraculously move in ways that we couldn't have moved for ourselves. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that where the limited nature of a limited father comes in, we've all got different father situations. We've all had different parental strife and failure and successes, and it would be so easy to look at who our parents were and give them all the credit or give them all the blame. But God, I think about Moses and how you allowed him to be raised in one culture and then come back and deliver it through another. You know, the father figures that you brought into Moses' life that helped orchestrate and engineer the transition from one culture to the next. from a harsh culture to a merciful one. God, that you made yourself real to Moses in the desert in a way that he could be an effective leader without resorting back to old culture. You took a man that would kill an Egyptian soldier in a moment of rage, and you turned him into somebody who would lovingly lead the Israelites out of slavery into the promised land. I guess the prayer would be, God, help us to identify the old cultures in our life, the old places of power and demands and anger and rage that are causing damage instead of creating influence. God, for the generation of people coming up behind us, help us to get it right, God, so that they've got a positive culture that they can replicate to their people. Help us to be better parents, be better leaders. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.